Hey Heather, thanks for meeting with me on such short notice to talk about my brother.
Absolutely. What questions can I answer for you today?
I just had some questions kind of about the anatomy of the brain. Would you mind explaining a little bit about it?
Sure. Well, first we have the skull, which is the hard protective covering that protects the brain. And then we have the brainstem, which is down here, and it controls sleep and waking, swallowing, balance, coordinations of muscles for speech. We have the cerebellum, which is more the coordination and the balance center. It also controls arm and leg movements and eye movements. Then we have a structure deeper in the brain called the ventricles, and that's where the cerebrospinal fluid is, that kind of the liquid that helps cushion the brain.
Okay. And now when people have a brain injury or a traumatic brain injury, does it depend on where in the brain was injured, or does everybody have the same types of problems?
That's a good question. It really does depend on what part of the brain was injured. So if we go back to the brain, we have the cerebrum, which is the left and right parts of the brain, and it's also called the gray matter. They play a key role in memory and attention and awareness. We also have a lobe called the frontal lobe, which is more your higher executive functions. Also controls behavior, some emotion. So the frontal lobe is the higher executive functions and is part of your planning, your organization, your judgment. Then you have your parietal lobes, which play a role in the integration and processing of some of the sensory information. Then you have the occipital lobe, which is back here in the back, and that's responsible for processing visual information. The temporal lobes are involved in forming new memories as well as comprehending spoken language.
Okay. And now how do all those different lobes communicate with each other?
Well, they communicate via things that are called neurons. So the parts of the neuron is the cell body, which is like the main function center of the neuron. And then it has this long cord, almost like an extension cord or an electrical cord called the axon. And that's what sends the impulse away from the cell body. And then at the end of the axon are dendrites that look like little tentacles almost. And those send signals from one neuron to another. And they also are responsible for releasing different types of chemicals that are responsible for brain health. So think back to our conversation about the other parts of the brain. There are also other structures that control different things like mood, motivation, attention, memory, and behavior. That's part of your limbic system. Then you have a strip on your brain called the motor cortex, which is involved in the planning and execution of movement. Then you have the somatosensory cortex, which is responsible for taking in information and processing it. And those, you get information from receptors in your skin and on your joints and different parts of your body. Then you have your primary visual cortex, which is also responsible for processing that visual information.
Okay. So that makes a little sense now. Would you mind telling me a little bit about what exactly it means to have a traumatic brain injury?
Sure. There's two types of injuries. There's a closed head injury, which means nothing penetrates the skull. And then there's an open head injury, where there's some sort of penetration to the skull and sometimes the underlying tissue. The primary injury is what happens immediately after the brain injury. And then there's secondary injuries, which are effects that can happen later on after the initial primary injury.
Okay. And now how does everybody determine how bad of an injury it was?
Well, there's a number of different assessment scales that the rehab team will use to measure the severity of the brain injury. So they might use the Glasgow-Coma scale, which is scored from 3 to 15. They may use the assessment for post-traumatic amnesia. They may use the Ranchos Los Amigos levels of cognitive functioning, which is scored from 1 to 10. And then they also monitor with CT scans and MRIs.
Okay.
There's also 3 traumatic brain injury categories. And it depends on the extent of injury to the axons and the other structures of the brain. So there's a mild traumatic brain injury, which may have a brief loss of consciousness or no loss of consciousness at all. Scans may look normal on those CTs and MRIs. They may have a concussion and concussion-like symptoms, like a headache or fatigue or wanting to sleep more, maybe some memory issues. A more moderate traumatic brain injury is a loss of consciousness for several minutes or a few hours, symptoms of concussions that may last for days or weeks, and impairments may last for months or even years.
Okay.
And then there's a more severe traumatic brain injury where a person stays in a coma or a vegetative state.
Okay. So that's starting to kind of make sense to me now, but it's kind of a lot to take in all at once. What should I do if I have any more questions down the road?
Well, certainly you can talk to me or anyone else on the rehab team, but you can also contact members at Northeast Rehab Hospital in Salem, Nashua, and Portsmouth.
Okay.
And lastly, you can also look at this book that should be in your brother's room, the Patient Education Manual.
All right, thanks. I'll take a look at it.